So we have to move ahead, and I'm very happy to introduce now our last speaker, Carol Kidron. She's Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at University of Haifa, and she has undertaken comparative ethnographic work on memory of Holocaust descendants in Israel and children of Cambodian genocide survivors in Cambodia and in Canada. And she's also examined the localization of Euro-Western discourses on memorialization, justice, reconciliation, victimhood, and trauma in Cambodia, while exploring sites of friction in the contact zones of local global encounter. And I'd like to say that she's also recently appointed associate editor of transcultural psychiatry. So we move now to Cambodia and genocide and testimony.
Thank you so much, Hadass, for this invitation. Fantastic event. I'm going to share my screen.
Thank you.
And if you could just tell me, does everybody see that?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. So, in a Buddhist wat in Phnom Penh, an elderly Cambodian genocide survivor stands weeping as a young Cambodian NGO staff member reads the survivor's testimony before an audience of monks, local Cambodian NGO stakeholders, and foreign NGO benefactors. The written testimony is then handed over to the monk, who sprinkles holy water on the text as he chants a traditional Buddhist blessing, exchanging merit with the genocide dead and releasing the survivor of her painful past. Note in the photo from the clip that you'll see soon, he says, "Try to forget these painful memories." The NGO website globally circulates a video clip of the above ritual termed testimony therapy, describing it as follows. In cooperation with a counselor, they, the genocide survivors, can restore their painful memories and convert them into a written document, a testimony. This practice allows victims to express and process traumatic experiences, to honor the spirits of the dead, and to document human rights violations. The website also includes clips of survivors voicing the very beneficial impact of their testimony on their well-being. So I will now stop sharing, and Yoav, please be so kind as to show us 2 minutes of testimony therapy. Thank you.
ចិត្តទឹកប្រាក់អាចជាសំណងសង់ជាចែកដីរួមនៅវត្តជើងឯកម្យ៉ាងវិញទៀតខ្ញុំចង់ឲ្យមេដឹកនាំទាំងនោះទទួលទោសទៅតាមច្បាប់ចំពោះអ្វីដែលពួកគេបានប្រព្រឹត្តសូមចោល បានរំលោភបំពានមកលើរូបកាយខ្ញុំនិងបានវាយដំមកលើរូបកាយខ្ញុំរហូតដល់ខ្ញុំសន្លប់អត់ស្មារតីពេលដែលខ្ញុំដឹងខ្លួនខ្ញុំបានដេកនៅលើភ្លឺស្រែដូចជាសត្វធាតុគ្មានអ្វីដែលសេសសល់សម្រាប់ខ្ញុំទេការឈឺចាប់ទាំងផ្លូវកាយនិងផ្លូវចិត្តដែលខ្ញុំមិនអាចបំភ្លេចបានការរើសអើងពីសំណាក់អ្នកភូមិកាលពីសម័យខ្មែរក្រហមរហូតមកដល់បច្ចុប្បន្ននេះក៏នៅតែមានការរើសអើងសម្រាប់គ្រួសារខ្ញុំនៅក្នុងសហគមន៍ភាពអាស្រ័យដែលគេធ្វើមកលើខ្ញុំធ្វើឲ្យខ្ញុំសម្រេចចិត្តចាក់ចេញពីស្រុកកំណើតដើម្បីលាក់ប្រវត្តិរូបខ្ញុំមានអារម្មណ៍សោកសម្រេងជារៀងរាល់ថ្ងៃហើយគិតថាខ្ញុំជាមនុស្សខុសពីគេឯងខ្ញុំរំពឹងថាពួកគេគួរតែទទួលទោសទណ្ឌឲ្យសមទៅនឹងអំពើព្រៃផ្សៃរបស់គេខ្ញុំចង់ឲ្យគេសងនៅសំណងផ្លូវចិត្តជារួមខ្ញុំចង់បានយុត្តិធម៌អំពីការកាត់ក្តីរបស់តុលាការ
Now moves over to the Buddhist portion. This is the point where the monk says, try to forget these painful memories. Okay. Thank you, Yoav. Going back to my screen share, do you see that?
Yes.
Great. Wonderful. Okay. Trauma testimony is one of a number of hybrid genocide commemorative practices in Cambodia, orchestrated by the Cambodian NGO TPO, or Transcultural Psychosocial Organization, based on consultancy with Western therapists. The ritual syncretizes, or mishalev for Hebrew speakers, Euro-Western commemorative practices with Buddhist Cambodian ritual. In the case of trauma testimony, hybridization is complex, as it entails psychological talk therapy and embedded truth claims regarding the salutogenic properties of testimony and working through with Buddhist spiritual meaning worlds, in this case, with Buddhist healing practices and merit exchange with ancestral spirits. Competent cultural translation is central here to the success of hybrid commemoration, as Khmer Buddhists traditionally avoid public voicing of genocide suffering. They consider representation of past evil or personal recollections of atrocity as risking physical, emotional, and spiritual distress. Cambodian ethnopsychology considers too much thinking about difficult pasts or Kutchan, the etiology or cause of illness, and not as what we would in the West consider the traumatizing event. In other words, they consider thinking too much as the cause and not the event, which we would consider is the cause of the thinking too much. Why is this? As they believe that the event may and should be forgotten. They do not forget the dead, ritually exchanging merit with them on a monthly basis. They only forget the evil event in which they perished. By adding Buddhist components to the hybrid ritual, local Cambodian NGO-based therapists spiritually domesticate Euro-Western therapeutic and commemorative discourse and practice. If successful, testimony therapy would mark one more step towards the globalization of Cambodian witnesses to the genocide past and the constitution of public Cambodian collective genocide memory. So I would like to pose a number of critical questions. Number one, the call to testify to past traumatic events entails a Euro-Western formalization of temporality and causality, where the subject loops back to the past to seek and document historical root causes of present and future suffering. Assuming Cambodian Buddhists have released the genocide past and, according to their meaning world, resiliently avoided any recollection of that past, a past they would assert makes them ill, is it ethical to orchestrate testimony therapy in the service of Euro-Western agendas of universalization and globalization of Holocaust and genocide memory? In the spirit of the topic of this conference, are Cambodian witnesses in testimony therapy looping back to the genocide past to make the past permanently present and to create public genocide memory? And if they are, for whom? Or alternatively, do the Buddhist components of the ceremony and the Buddhist taken for granted way of being in the world promote acceptance and release of the past? If survivors are releasing the past, does the ritual constitute only a brief presence, only to facilitate absence? Do the two sides of the hybrid create anything new at all? Or in each side, does the foreign advisor and Cambodian just separately perpetuate their own meaning worlds? What then are the implications of the humanitarian regime and global mental health when these rituals aim to promote a universal Holocaust and genocide global pedagogy and post-conflict wellness? Scholarship has documented the globalization of trauma discourse and trauma-related therapeutic practices in diverse cultural contexts. Critical psychiatry and psychology have questioned the universality of the trauma construct, problematizing the global uniformity. The global uniformity of pathology and symptomology while critical clinicians raise concerns regarding the cultural competency of globalized trauma care. Anthropologists in particular have critiqued the global dissemination of trauma, claiming that universal and culturally particular forms of distress are needlessly pathologized despite resilience, and that both symptomology and core constitutive meaning systems shaping resilient or complex ideational configurations of distress and wellness are either ignored or misinterpreted as traumatic responses. In response, transcultural psychiatrists have promoted hybrid or global localized mental health diagnostics and treatment, such as trauma testimony, to prevent the imposition of culturally incompetent healthcare. However, global health cannot be contextualized from global politics. Human rights and development regimes have engendered a new kind of traumatized moral therapeutic subject. Valorized to provide public testimony to the traumatic pasts, victims of social suffering are provided the necessary skills to take on the role of public witness. Post-conflict truth-telling is perceived as psychologically, but also politically redemptive for the subject and for post-conflict nations. The previously wounded and disempowered victim and the war-torn nation state work hand in hand to perform truth-telling and psychological working through toward personal and global acknowledgement and reconciliation with the past as pathway to global peace. A few words on Cambodian history. In 1975, the Cambodian Communist Khmer Rouge regime, led by Pol Pot, instigated the forced evacuation of urban populations to the countryside to work as farmers. Beyond the brutal mass roundups and executions of intellectuals, bureaucrats, and businessmen, educated Cambodians and Buddhist monks, hundreds of thousands died of starvation and disease. The total death toll between 1975 and 1979 has been estimated between 2 to 3 million. According to Sonis et al., in 2001, 28.4% of the Khmer population were suffering from PTSD, highlighting the severity of psychological suffering. With the restoration of global support in the 1990s, Cambodia's decimated mental health sector began to rebuild. Working with international NGOs such as TPO, the Ministry of Health trained psychiatrists and psychiatric nurses, establishing small clinics in Cambodia's provinces. The Transcultural Psychosocial Organization, TPO, established a branch of the Dutch-based NGO TPO International. TPO Cambodia is the leading NGO in Cambodia providing mental health and psychosocial intervention. TPO provides a variety of treatment technologies, including psychological face-to-face counseling, cognitive behavioral therapy, and psychiatric medication. However, testimony therapy, the main focus of this talk, is one of TPO's more innovative treatment technologies. The ritual I described at the opening of this talk is part of an intense week-long testimonial process. Survivors who have already undergone first psychological screening by TPO practitioners in their villages travel to Phnom Penh to document their genocide experiences in interviews with TPO practitioners and interviewers from DCCAM, Cambodia's Yad Vashem. It is during this interview that their written document presented in testimony therapy is created. The survivor then appears before the EEC, the hybrid tribunal, to give their testimony. Witnesses are then taken to the killing fields where they are filmed as they recount their testimony again. The films distributed on various NGO mental health and/or genocide-related websites. The survivors then visit the collective commemorative monument or stupa for genocide victims at the site of the killing fields, lighting incense in memory of the dead as a way of giving and receiving merit. So just a quick picture. I apologize if this is difficult to look at. These are the human remains displayed in the stupas. These are Cambodian genocide victims who should have been, according to Cambodian tradition, cremated, but were not, in order to display them in a very Euro-Western iteration of our own atrocity displays, which is extremely not in keeping, although thought in keeping by many NGOs, with Cambodian culture, Buddhist culture. Traditionally, veneration to the familial dead at stupa monuments serves to cosmologically liberate dead relatives so they may continue on the path to redemptive rebirth. Survivors then attend a commemorative ceremony followed by a collective Buddhist ritual at a local temple. The final stage of the week-long process is the testimony therapy ritual that takes place in a Buddhist temple, where TPO and DC camp counselors read the victims' testimonies to the gathered audience of monks, priests, witnesses, NGO advocates, and TPO staff. The survivors then receive their individual testimony folders, the counselor declaring that the survivors suffered and they tried to forget, but now their heart is open again to tell their story. Kneeling before the monks, survivors exchange their folder story for purification, blessing, and merit. The monk who accepts the testimony places a red band on the arm of the survivor to ward off evil spirits of the restless dead. Survivors are then purified with holy water and released from their suffering. As I outlined above, testimony therapy aims to syncretize psychological talk therapy with psychological therapeutic truth claims pertaining to testimony, commemoration, and aims to symbolically ally psychological discourse practice with Buddhist traditional cosmological meanings and practices pertaining to death, karma, family ties, and merit exchange. The new hybridizing ritual hopes to trigger multiple symbolic passages between very different culturally particular cosmologics of personhood, memory and time, and even individual collective roles, and in the process aims to facilitate the transition from Cambodian ethno-psychological therapeutic logic to psychological therapeutic logic by spiritually domesticating the psychological therapeutic discourse and practice of talk therapy. The new emotional style constituting self-memory work, therapeutic talk, and global genocide witnessing is evident in the transition from forgetting to the open heart that tells the story, purifying the stigma of psychological, narcissistic self-management. Testimony fulfills the traditional Buddhist filial obligation of blessing and liberating the spirits of the genocide dead. As we saw in the Stupa Memorial Tower, the dead are trapped in limbo between the bad death and the desired identification and familial cremation ceremony. However, and more questions, does the Cambodian survivor experience testimony as reflexive self-work and working through, or as a form of exorcism of the past to enable forgetting? Girush tiksi shel shedim me'ha'avar, לשחרר את העבר ולאפשר שכחה וטהרה, purification. Do they experience it as a pathway to absence of the event? According to the TPO website, public testimony without psychosocial intervention and support risks traumatization. Testimony may trigger resurfacing of traumatic memories, feelings of anger, revenge, thereby blocking the processes of healing and reconciliation that form the TPO and EEC tribunals' psychological and humanitarian goals. As implied by the project's name, Relief and Justice, translating talk therapy into culture-specific testimony therapy, however, TPO promotional reports indicate that witnesses enjoying the support and psychological education of TPO hybrid technologies experience both relief and justice. In the only hybrid court where local legal officials and foreign jurists work together, witnesses are literally relieved of their psychological and civic burden and receive justice. Considering the humanitarian and financial agenda of the TPO website, it is necessary to treat these promotional videos with a critical eye. Only ethnographic accounts, in my view, of local perceptions can determine if and how interlocutors on the ground experience trauma-related emotion and unpack the political context of Cambodian ethnopsychological or psychological therapeutic subjectivities. So just a few very, very quick examples. So Sopal considered the benefits of talk therapy. I asked, Western experts suggest that survivors must talk to release stress. Is it useful? Sopal answers, survivors talk, but in a calm, peaceful, and sometimes funny atmosphere. It happens that survivors laugh when they recall some stories. The way of approaching this subject between them is spontaneous, without having a purpose to appease the pain. They seemed sad at the beginning of conversation, but at the end, they become very happy. Carol, I asked, NGOs can work with survivors, helping them give testimony about the past. They believe it will help them relieve their pain too. So Sopal answers, people do not feel the same pain after 30 years. They forget it already, they forget it already, but some remains in their memory. It is unnecessary that these NGOs are considering this approach. It is a waste of money. They do not need therapy, of course. They remember the past, but they do not live with the past. Their priority is now how to improve their living conditions. So just to save time, I won't do the usual analysis. I think the data speaks for itself. Asking Kichi if she thinks a lot about the genocide past, she answers, not at all. This is my karma, and this is my brother's karma. It has been more than 30 years since the Khmer Rouge were in control of the country. I have no interest in thinking about the past. I forget the past. I concentrate on doing bon, which is spiritual merit or acts that promote merit, behave good actions, and give donation to the pagoda, to the Wat, to have merit. I do rituals for my brother, who is a genocide victim. After Khmer Rouge, I make up my life and I take care of my rice fields. I do not believe in this approach, talking about the past. Talk is good, but they do not have to talk about the Khmer Rouge or the past. They can choose a general subject. For me, push survivors to talk about painful past is like pushing them to live again in this sad time. And then finally, in an interview with two survivor sisters, Bofa and Pick, I asked them if they gave testimony at the NGO. Pick responded, I heard in the village that the NGO gives money to those who tell their story. The village head said, go, the NGO helps us. We need money, so I went to the ritual. In the end, I talked. It was so hard, better to forget. I cried, and when I went home, I was sick, and if not for my sister alone, I got nothing. I should not have gone. Testimony therapy orchestrates a Buddhist Western hybrid therapeutic context where the traumatized therapeutic subject as witness may be enlisted by the nation state and global community to perform newly acquired emotional technologies of the self, namely the performance of reflexivity, emotional talk, ventilation, and self-work, something we're familiar with in Holocaust commemoration in Israel. The witness represents the alliance between therapeutic culture and the human rights regime. In this way, the truth claims related to victimhood and suffering, truth-telling, reconciliation, and peace are sustained as moral pillars of the neoliberal late modern global community. Although a minority of young, upwardly mobile elite Cambodian NGO workers and psychological practitioners now adopt therapeutic talk, it is yet unclear to what extent they have acquired a therapeutic habitus. Findings point to extensive friction between Euro-Western therapeutic culture and emotional style on the one hand, and culturally particular Cambodian emotional style on the other hand. Points of friction include avoidance of emotional working through, avoidance of talk therapy, and vocal public memory work in search of traumatic root causes of distress, and resistance to therapeutic person-centered practitioner-patient interaction in favor of familial and communal support. Buddhist acceptance discursively clashes with emotional capitalism's drive towards self-change, self-improvement, and agency. Finally, in Cambodia, distress and the emotional talk pertaining to these fields cannot be uncoupled from political and economic structural violence, which many interlocutors perceived as the root cause of their distress. Returning to the presence or absence of genocide memory at the testimony therapy, and with this I will conclude. Considering the taken for granted meaning worlds of Buddhist release of the genocide past and forward-looking perspective, it would seem that Cambodian survivors attend testimony therapy primarily for pragmatic purposes, satisfying local village heads' dependence on NGO support, or perhaps there may be those who seek a ritual form of release and purification, but I must emphasize that every monk in every village can and does provide the same ritual purification to survivors who, despite attempts at forgetting, are haunted by the past. There is, of course, no doubt that week-long testimonials in the hybrid court, in the killing fields, and in the Buddhist temple create genocide presence. Institutional documentation documents and archives evidence and circulates it on the World Wide Web. Yet considering Cambodian perspectives on collective genocide commemoration, genocide presence in testimony therapy is performed, as I've claimed elsewhere, as simulacra, an image, site, or event similar to reality but not real, to sustain lucrative rivchi relations with foreign NGO stakeholders and the global community, and of course to perpetuate local Cambodian NGOs who are the key mediators between Cambodia and the global community. For the Cambodian survivor, presence of the genocide is and must be brief. It must be long enough to maintain relations with essential NGO patrons, like the exchange with the spirits of their ancestors. NGO patrons may also be ritually satisfied, but genocide presence must ultimately be released, making way for absence. In the Euro-Western commemorative practices, like in Holocaust ceremonies, we know so well, we create presence, not only to honor the dead, but to allow for pathos, empathy, embodiment, and identification that teaches or intensifies commitment to humanist or non-humanist values of genocide prevention. I leave it up to the audience to consider if the simulacra illusion of temporary presence performed at hybrid ceremonies in Cambodia, Rwanda, Mozambique may, despite cultural differences, indoctrinate these moral messages. Yet I would assert, as I have elsewhere, that genocide commemoration in Cambodia is a perfect failure, where despite failed translation of Cambodian desire to forget the past, rituals and memorials create the perfect outcome. The global community receives a simulacra illusion of genocide pedagogy, supporting the imaginary of global universal common language of peace and prevention, while survivors continue to absence the past in keeping with their cultural tradition, while accessing much needed support with which to face contemporary challenges rather than forgotten pasts. Returning to the title of the talk, and this is my last sentence, the irony of cultural competency of commemoration and forgetting in Cambodia. I would say for the Cambodians, commemorative events are both ironic and paradoxical. They signify at once the contrary of what is intended, absence instead of presence, as well as the simulacra or illusion or lucrative illusion of presence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carol. And we've had such an interesting fabric to observe and to sew and unravel with the talks we had in this panel from Dana, Adi, and Carol. And I really appreciate you all staying with us. So if there's one or two questions, you are invited to ask, or if Amit wants to add something, then we can take a few more minutes, and I really want to thank all our speakers and all of you for joining us. Yes. Luan?
I have a kind of a comment, so
Yeah,
we can
please, Amit.
begin the discussion. It seems to me that the first part, the technological part, let's call it, the emphasis was on the reception, on how how audiences and listeners engage with testimonies, and in this part, it was mainly on the witnesses and the survivors and how they undergo testimony. And it's really fascinating. Three fascinating talks that come from different perspectives. Well, not that different. I mean, it revolves really around trauma, which is something that kind of, evaded the first part. I mean, there was this discussion about the missing memory or the status of the memory of the sister, but whether and to what extent this can be approached or addressed remained kind of in the background. And now it's really kind of at the center of the discussion, and especially following Carol's talk, which is kind of a fascinating contrastive case of how we are usually thinking about it. I have this kind of lingering thought, maybe the thing of there's a kind of maybe a collective or even culturally collective expectations of testimony to be implicated by trauma, right? So this is something we expect to have or to be built into testimony, especially Holocaust testimony, and therefore a certain kind of questions and a certain kind of approach is kind of being urged when we engage with survivors. So it's kind of a two-way kind of expectation in which trauma is it's both there and it both expect it to be, and therefore it becomes such a prominent trope for on all those levels of engagement with testimony. So I wonder, even in the fact that we are kind of something in our expectations, especially with the or the technological kind of testimony, that something is missing there. Well, maybe it's that trauma that is missing there, and this, therefore we feel this is something, there's something fake about it because it doesn't give us what we expected. It doesn't fulfill the expectation. So this is, I think, the kind of something that goes through here, the status that trauma, both as a kind of a collective experience of testimony, has come to be and constitute for us.
When I must say it also, thinking of Pinchas Guterman, just the fact that he could go all of this, it speaks also for resilience of, to be able to do this. But definitely it's a different kind of discourse. And I guess, Amit, you're talking about the trauma discourse and also the cultural framework, because in our culture, we put so much emphasis on the past, and we also always ask families of Holocaust survivors living with the past, and Carol is telling us that you're not supposed to live with the past, you're supposed to look forward, and it's not culturally right to sort of put the emphasis from our lenses. Maybe you want to add something, Carol or Dana.
Whoever first.
Dana. Yeah, Dana.
Just one sentence. Just wanted to say, relating to Carol's beautiful lecture, that the thought that there is one protocol for grieving is unthinkable. There are as much protocols of grieving as probably as people. So, but Carol, to
Yeah.
say what you
you,
want to
Dana.
say.
Yeah, thank you. So, you know, I have two comments that I'd like to make, and one relates to Dana's also amazing paper, and I hope a little bit to Adi as well. That, you know, I still am obsessed with this original frame of ours of crisis of representation, and I feel as if we are not rarely dealing with the actual experience, and perhaps the therapists among you would not agree, but we are at least, well, even if I want to be objective and not critical, I would say we are dealing with the experience framed by, as Hadass said, you know, cultural understandings, and one of them remains, you know, excuse the comparison, like the gate, you know, Arbeit macht frei, we have our own gates of the crisis. And for me, you know, I feel as if also in Dana's paper and in, you know, mine, I feel, you know, this comparison between metonym and metaphor, and creating a continuum of different degrees between the real and unreal, between the experience that is, you know, excessive and not excessive. We are not letting go, and this continuum sustains the presence for us in our analysis. So it's not you, Dana. I mean, this is our cultural zeitgeist that we have, you know, we are still dealing with this. And what for me, as you know, I'm second generation, the idea that I went to Cambodia and I had to go through some kind of shock, you know, of people telling me it is possible to let go as an Israeli, Jewish second generation. There couldn't have been more shock therapy than that. So, yeah, so I mean, I would say also that, you know, the Cambodians, in my terms, are lucky in the sense they're still haunted at night in their dreams. But during the day, their meaning system allows them not to have that continuum. And whether that's real or not is another question.
Yeah. Okay, anyone else wants to add or? Okay.
Have Ozzy Grishman here.
Yeah, please read the question you have.
No, he's not. He raised his hand. So.
Oh, go ahead, Ozzy.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I was just thinking about something that I noted in the original talk, and then something from Dana's talk. In the earlier talk, one of the speakers referred to PTSD as the strengthening of neural pathways, and that coming to terms with PTSD requires something along the lines of putting that experience in a box to keep it away from the self. And I was thinking about metaphor and wondering if you think metaphor is this mechanism, like you talked about different, right, metaphor, metonymy, things like that, that is the metaphor necessary in order to achieve some kind of meaning? Do you think that the only way to make meaning of these experiences, right, it's this challenging experience because the trauma is so crucial to the sense of oneself, but is it there to a point where the only way to really come to terms with it is through metaphor, through some way of separating from the self? If that makes sense.
Well, as a poet, I must agree that metaphors create meaning, and that we need metaphors to create meaning. But again, coming back to what Carol said, I think that there are many ways of creating meaning, and also many ways of letting go meaning in order to embrace life itself. Mm-hmm. And I think that to I don't know, to sign a hegemonic protocol of how it should be is wrong. It's wrong psychoanalytically as well as wrong anthropologically. It's wrong. We need to create a language of grieving, and this language must serve the person that is speaking this language. And if this person needs metaphors, it's fine. And if this person needs to destroy the metaphors in order to get back his or her life, it's fine as well.
Okay. So thank you all very much for staying with us and for joining us. Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Adi, Dana, Carol. We will thank our international guests tomorrow night. And thank you very much, Yoav, for all of your help in making this run smoothly. And wonderful to see you from different places in the world. And past students and so forth, and current students.
Thank you,
very
Adas.
much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.